Joining us now is a friend of the program who hasn't been on for a while. Rebecca Vallas is the managing director of the Poverty to Prosperity program at the Center for American Progress. She is also the host of the recently renamed and relaunched radio program and podcast, which used to have a different name. I think it was called Talk Poverty. I know it was. And now it is called Off-Kilter. Rebecca, thanks for joining us.
RJ, thanks so much for having me on the show. How you been?
I've been great. Always great to have you on the program. And so why the name change? You know, it seems to me, before we get into the policy stuff we're going to talk about, Talk Poverty and Off-Kilter are like super different in what they imply. So what's the name change about?
So, 2 years ago, Talk Poverty Radio launched as the only weekly radio show and podcast that was entirely devoted to covering poverty and inequality week in and week out. And we actually started on Sirius. We ended up moving to We Act Radio and the Progressive Voices Network and to a bunch of terrestrial stations as well, in large part because we weren't comfortable having all of our content about poverty behind a paywall. But over the years, we've been there with voices like Melissa Harris Perry from the media, used to be with MSNBC, to policy experts and folks who are, on the ground fighting to change policies. But most importantly, the voices of people who themselves are living paycheck to paycheck, struggling to make ends meet, who are all too rarely heard and really are the real experts on these issues. So the show has been a lot of fun and really has been an important part of the work that we do at the Center for American Progress. But when you ask why the name change, I don't know how your listeners are feeling, and RJ, I don't know how you're feeling, but when I look around at the world as it is right now, post-election, things are pretty effed up right now.
Well,
things it feels like are kind of all burning everywhere all around us. And so we felt the need to take resistance from the streets to the airwaves and to change the show up a little bit so it'll still be devoted to poverty and inequality, but it's going to have a double dose of resistance and a lot more voices from the ground who are out there trying to stop this policy agenda from becoming reality.
Okay, and then why, I get that part, and then why Off-Kilter?
Well, we're at a point where inequality remains at historic heights. The 20 richest Americans hold more of the nation's wealth than the entire bottom half of the population. And I don't know how you feel about that, but I would say that that's an off-kilter economy. And then you add to it the fact that two branches of our government are now run by people who are committed to fighting for the wealthiest among us instead of the 1 in 3 Americans who are struggling to make ends meet. Our president is, some may argue, and I think this is a fair characterization, a white nationalist sitting in the White House, hell-bent on further marginalizing anyone who doesn't look or pray or love like he does, and yet proclaiming a mandate to advance an incredibly hateful policy agenda. So Off-Kilter felt to us like not just the way the economy is at this point in time, but really the entire political system and the world that we're living in.
Yeah, okay, I get that. I mean, look, I'm always saying, as many people are, that I feel like we slipped into an alternative timeline where nothing seems right. I mean, they used to have all sorts of shows, Continuum and Fringe, and all these science fiction shows that were about alternate timelines, and it was always like, this is wacky. So I feel like we're in one of those timelines now. So I get that. In fact, the only thing I would disagree with you about, Rebecca, is that I don't think whatever it is that Trump does in the privacy of his own home can be described as love. But
well, I haven't talked to Melania about it, but I you're probably right.
I don't want to know. Now, I'm sure you guys have been covering, as we have been here this week, we're a weekly show, but I'm sure you guys have been talking a lot about the so-called American Health Care Act, which, I've described, by the way, explicitly in writing and here on the show as designed to increase inequality. I mean, it is a mechanism for increasing inequality by taking away the progressive taxes in the program and so on, in the Affordable Care Act and so on. But The one aspect of it, we've talked about it, and we'll talk about it a lot on this week's show. But the one aspect that you can talk about, I think, most effectively with us about is this Republican proposal's effect on the lower income Americans, whether it is through Medicaid or and its plan to. It seems to me let's start with that. It seems to me that this is pure and simple when you cut away all the BS. It's the Republican proposal is a plan to pretty much eliminate Medicaid. Am I overstating the case?
No, you're not at all. It's not histrionic to describe this as ending Medicaid as we know it. I mean, I think it's important to start by emphasizing that the plan that they've put forth, it just doesn't work. It's not even something we should really even dignify as with the characterization that it is actually a healthcare plan. It's not. It's a hot mess, is what it is. Now, if you start to actually take apart all the pieces to think about what it would do, you're exactly right. It is effectively a plan to redistribute massive amounts of wealth from lower income and middle class folks up to the wealthiest among us. That's basically what it is, a huge tax giveaway to wealthy families. But it's also really its own special recipe for not just removing health insurance from millions upon millions of low-income, middle-income folks, particularly folks who are in their 50s and early 60s who aren't yet eligible for Medicare, but it's also a plan to roll back disability rights 5 decades, maybe even more. And that's a big part of the conversation that's really been missing so far.
Okay, so let's
what
talk about that.
Medicaid means for people with disabilities.
Okay, tell us about that. Tell us, first of all, let's start with this. The mechanism, and you elaborate where necessary, but the mechanism for eliminating Medicaid, I consider it a mechanism, and clearly you do, that I see in it is the fact that it's going to switch to essentially a capped system of payment that will probably be insufficient upon its creation and to cover actual Medicaid costs, and then will just become a fraction of what's needed over time.
That's exactly right, RJ. And so they use a lot of, they being the conservatives advancing this plan, use a lot of fancy-sounding words like per capita cap. Trump himself has said that this plan is about giving flexibility to the states, but people really need to be clear on the fact that the plan for Medicaid is spelled C-U-T. What it does is to limit the amount of federal funds that are being sent through Medicaid to the states to administer their state Medicaid programs. And so in addition to massively shifting costs onto the states in the process, this plan is going to force states to make decisions between whether they should cover a cancer survivor, whether they should cover a kid in a wheelchair, whether they should cover a senior who's living in a nursing home. Those are the kinds of decisions, really Sophie's choices, that states are going to end up having to make because of this limitation on the funds they're going to be given. And so one of the things that people really need to understand, I mean, President Trump, and I hate calling him that, but President Trump, during the campaign, he made his disregard for people with disabilities well known when he mocked a disabled reporter from the New York Times, and he did that at a big campaign rally, putting his arms in the air and waving them around. That disregard has now transcended being words. It has entered the realm of policies that are absolutely terrifying for people who need Medicaid to get out of bed in the morning, to be able to go to work, and to be able to be contributing, tax-paying members of this society. He is effectively threatening to push 15 million Americans, by CAP's analysis, with disabilities out of their homes, out of their communities, and into institutions like we saw in the 1950s. That was commonly the case.
Right, and this was, by the way, this was a sort of Dickensian situation for a lot of people. I mean, it's horrible when people can be integrated into the community to then condemn them. Obviously there are good institutions and so on, but to condemn people unnecessarily to a life of being institutionalized is really a horrible horrible thing to do. The one thing that I would, I don't know that we disagree on this, but the one, again, we're talking with Rebecca Vallas from the Off-Kilter radio show and podcast and the Center for American Progress. The one thing that I keep emphasizing over and over again is that as horrible and repellent as Trump is in terms of values, and that spectacle of him making fun of the disabled reporter was just hideous. When it comes to policy, I don't think he's that different. The Republicans have horrific Dickensian policies already. In that sense, to me, he's not an out-of-the-box Republican. They all want to do horrible things to the sick and the weakest and the most vulnerable among us. So in that sense, I worry. I don't want to normalize those other terrible people by just implying that it's only Trump. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Oh, it's absolutely not only Trump. I mean, this plan came out of the Republican Party in Congress. Trump is the one who endorsed what they came up with. So a lot of folks are calling it Trump care, but it is really important that people understand this is Trump walking in lockstep with his colleagues in Congress, who have all very clearly made repealing the Affordable Care Act and ending Medicaid as we know it top of their to-do list. And I also, just to add to that, you described some of the folks that we've been talking about, including people with disabilities, as being among the most vulnerable among us. And I think it's important to remember 1 in 5 Americans have a disability, and that ends up making them the largest minority group in the country. A friend of mine, Anastasia Somoza, who was one of the incredibly powerful speakers at the DNC, the convention last summer, she's people probably remember her because she's a young woman in a wheelchair who actually rebuked Trump for having mocked that disabled reporter. And I was speaking with her earlier this week because she was in town speaking at an event that CAP held on these very issues. And she very poignantly explains that not only are people with disabilities the largest minority group in the country at 1 in 5, but it's the only minority group that any of us could join at any given point in time. And that's something people need to remember as we think about what this plan means. It's not just some small group of people on the wrong side of the tracks that unfortunately a lot of folks in this country maybe don't feel sympathy for. That we're talking about millions upon millions upon millions of Americans, their families, their loved ones. This is going to have ripple effects throughout our nation.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely right. And I also want to be clear that when I say vulnerable, it doesn't mean in any way to diminish anyone. In fact, I qualify for definition. I had a mutual friend on whose name is, you introduced me to her, I'm blanking on her name, who ran the Office of Disability for President Obama. And I remember telling her the shock I had when, because of a condition I suffer for, I looked up the website at the airline to see what I could do about it on a plane trip, and it directed me to their page for people with disabilities. So my reaction was, wait a minute, But the fact is, many of us fall into that category. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to be stigmatized about. It's no reason not to be. You can't be and shouldn't be a fully a contributing member of society. And in the end, to me, that's the horror of this proposal, is that it takes people who are fully functioning in the stream of life and just siphons them out to a desperate, kind of a diminished life. And to me, that is a violation of everything I consider humane and decent.
Well, amen, and you said it incredibly well, and we should give her a shout out. I think you're talking about Rebecca Coakley.
I am.
Another dear friend of mine and someone who I learn from every single time I speak to her.
So what do we do? I mean, what's the plan going forward? People are obviously going to resist, in any way we can. Are you aware of organized pushback activities? We'll be talking about that a lot in the weeks to come on this show. Are you aware of any organized efforts to stop this plan from becoming law? Republicans may do it themselves because they're fighting among each other about it. But, of a way people can step in and voice their disapproval?
Well, we've been watching a lot of Republican infighting on this, as you describe. I mean, it's been amazing to see Heritage coming out and saying that they can't stand by the plan, the Freedom Caucus balking and saying it doesn't go far enough. Meanwhile, you've got folks on the left and in the center saying this plan doesn't work, the numbers don't add up, and people are literally going to have their lives on the line, as we've been describing. But I think one of the things that's been amazing to watch over the last several weeks has been just how much momentum this resistance movement has gained and how much momentum is growing every single day. The women's marches across the globe the day after Trump's inauguration drew crowds that he might not believe this because alternative facts reign supreme in that White House, but those crowds dwarfed Trump's own the day before his inauguration.
Yeah, I was there.
You were there, right? So you can attest.
Right, and you were there too, I'm sure. And look, no, it's been inspirational to see how people are resisting that agenda, and I'm hoping we can I'm optimistic that we can turn that agenda into a real movement. And I think there's every sign that's going to happen. But before I let you go, Rebecca Vallas, I do want to ask you where people can go to find your podcast and radio show.
Well, thank you for that opportunity, RJ. So folks can find us on iTunes by searching Off-Kilter. You can also find us on SoundCloud the same way. Follow us on Twitter at Off-Kilter Show, and you can find us on Facebook as well and give us a like and follow what we're up to there, facebook.com/Off-Kilter Show. The last thing I should say is if folks are curious how they can get involved and be part of this resistance, I would urge them to go to resistancenearme.com, which is a collaborative project between the Center for American Progress Action Fund, Indivisible, the movement that's been sweeping the nation and now has groups in all 435 congressional districts, and a whole range of other activists and resistors. Go to resistancenearme.com, check it out. It will help connect you with opportunities to get involved and actions and town halls and other things near you, so that you can raise your voice and make sure that your member of Congress hears you as you tell them what repealing the Affordable Care Act or rolling back Medicaid or everything else in the Trump and Paul Ryan agenda would mean for you, would mean for your loved ones, and would mean for your families. It's really important that people raise their voices. That is how we are going to stop this agenda.
Okay, got to leave it there, but thank you for that. And Rebecca Vallas, Managing Director of the Poverty to Prosperity Program at the Center for American Progress and host of Off-Kilter, thanks for joining us.
RJ, thanks so much.